China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are working with increasing cooperation and coordination in ways that are threatening to a number of democracies that the United States and its allies have been backing. Ukraine is one, Israel's another, Taiwan is probably next. I mean, there was a time when the US really was the arsenal of democracy. I made this point some time ago in a Bloomberg column. It's quite a bit behind China, which is now the arsenal of autocracy, with manufacturing value added roughly 2x that of the United States. In the event of a hot war with China, the US would run out of precision missiles in about 5 days, more or less. That's a much worse situation than anything 50 years ago.
I think a lot of people might say, look at where we are. The West has accumulated huge debts. The West authority around the world is being challenged very robustly now, to put it mildly. We seem to have lost a moral will here in the West. There are many other indicators that we may be trending in the wrong direction. Would you agree with that, or are you more optimistic about the future?
A lot of what you just said is true, but you could also have said that in 1973. So 50 years ago, didn't look great, did it? Because the United States seemed to be losing the Cold War, basically had bailed on South Vietnam, which 2 years later was gone, poof. And it wasn't exactly going swimmingly in the Middle East. In October 1973, the Soviet Union, we know, was going to decline and fall with great speed in the 1980s. That wasn't obvious in 1973. The inflation problem of 73 was going to get a lot worse. It's plausibly not going to be as bad this decade. And I could go on. In 1973, America was already in the early phases of the Watergate disaster, which would bring Richard Nixon to resignation to avoid impeachment. If you had asked people 50 years ago, how's it going? There would have been a lot who'd have agreed with the declinists who really thought the game was up. There was a huge amount of division in the United States, and not only in the United States. I'm old enough to remember the 70s. It wasn't a particularly good time in the United Kingdom either. In fact, the UK was the sort of poster child of stagflation at that time. So what am I telling you? I'm not convinced that there's some great cycle at work here. It was pretty bad 50 years ago too. And 7 years later, Ronald Reagan's elected. 9 years later, Berlin Wall comes down. And 2 years after that, the Soviet Union's gone. So the lesson I would like to draw from history is there's a lot of nonlinearity. And you have to be, I think, making a more precise argument than you just did to get me properly worried. So let me try. So what is worrying today is not that we feel terribly divided or so polarized. And it's not particularly, I think, that there's a major economic problem. Actually, the United States economy is shockingly strong under the circumstances. I think the things that are concerning to me are, number one, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are working with increasing cooperation and coordination in ways that are threatening to a number of democracies that the United States and its allies have been backing. Ukraine is one, Israel's another, Taiwan is probably next. And secondly, China's really much bigger economically. It has much greater resources technologically too than any previous rival that the United States and its allies faced. The Soviet Union economically was never more than about 42% of GDP relative to the US. Well, China's a lot bigger than that. It's certainly in the 80% range. It's above 100% if you do a purchasing power parity calculation. So that's the second point. The third thing that is, I think, concerning is that the United States feels less able to cope with these geopolitical challenges than it was, say, 50 years ago. I'll give you one specific example of that. It cannot be right that with the economy at more or less full employment, there's a deficit of 7% of gross domestic product. And that is going to lead very quickly into some nasty fiscal arithmetic. To be specific, debt service costs are about to overtake defense spending. And that trend line is really not pretty, with interest rates rising and the deficits in excess of 5% of GDP as far as the eye can see. So I think the fiscal situation of the US is a lot worse than it was in 1973. And that means that the US isn't actually able to cope with three military crises at once. Lastly, the military-industrial complex ain't what it was. God, I miss it. I mean, there was a time when the US really was the arsenal of democracy. I made this point some time ago in a Bloomberg column. It's quite a bit behind China, which is now the arsenal of autocracy, with manufacturing value added roughly 2x that of the United States. You don't have to go back very far for it to be the other way around. Back in, I think, around 2002, 3, 4, the US was a manufacturing power much greater than China. So in the space of 2 decades, there's been a real role reversal. In the event of a hot war with China, the US would run out of precision missiles in about 5 days, more or less. That's a much worse situation than anything 50 years ago. So there are reasons to be worried, but I think you have to be quite precise about what you're worried about. And that's what I'm worried about.
Neil, let's broaden this topic out a little bit. How do civilizations actually fall?
Well, that's a good question. I think most people imagine, in a Toynbee-esque way, some kind of inner crisis of will, of morale, of self-belief. They think of it as perhaps a sort of aging process, or maybe it's just entropy at work. If one looks at the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, in Gibbon's telling, it's really a very protracted process. So protracted as to have been imperceptible, I think, for most contemporaries. But in more recent tellings, Brian Ward Perkins, for example, actually the Roman Empire fell apart quite fast, especially the Roman Empire in the West. And I think it was perceptible that civilization had sort of come unstuck. And I think we can understand similar processes if one looks, for example, in Chinese history. The Ming fell apart in the mid-17th century in a way that was very perceptible, with very meaningful impacts on quality of life. So we know what it's like when a civilization falls apart. The infrastructure stops working. Public health gets much worse. It can be caused by war. It can be caused by plague. It can be caused by other forces that are perhaps less discernible. For example, a civilization can fail fiscally. It can fail because its monetary system doesn't work, and it stops being able to deliver surpluses to the population. So I think we understand a little bit how that process works. And when you look at the work of someone like Peter Turchin, there is an attempt through his cliodynamics to construct models of civilizational breakdown and then look for a contemporary analogy. And in his most recent book, Peter argues that the United States is in this kind of a cycle. He emphasizes the overproduction of elites, too many people with university degrees, not enough for them to do. He, I thought, quite brilliantly forecast a sort of peak in organized violence in 2020, which I guess he got lucky with the pandemic and George Floyd and the subsequent mayhem, but it kind of looks quite good as a prediction right now. I guess when you look at all his variables, however, you could make a similar argument about China. In fact, one of the variables, demographics, looks worse for China. Another of the variables, overproduction of educated people, looks worse for China. So in my review of his book, which I like, I mean, I respect his work very much, I said, might be true, but it might turn out to be true of China more. A bit like Paul Kennedy's book, you might remember the Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which came out in 1987 and said there is a kind of a law of decline where if you're spending too much on one thing and not enough on defense, then your industrial capacity declines. And all of that was supposed to apply to the United States, but it turned out to be more true of the Soviet Union. So we can look for these signs of unraveling, but I think we have to be quite careful not to be so sure that it's a US problem that we miss other worse problems elsewhere. I think the US also has a kind of interesting track record of worrying about its own decline. I think it's a feature, not a bug, of the United States to worry about decline, or to worry that the republic's somehow going to enter a terminal crisis, or that American power is going to wane. Americans love worrying about that. It's one of the things that sells books and gets op-eds printed. And then it happens to the other guy, and Americans are like, gee, we won. And then there's the kind of euphoric decade before it's time to start worrying about decline again.
著名历史学者尼尔·弗格森这段不到10分钟的访谈真是让人大开眼界。在这么短的时间里，他居然能一边把中国威胁论说得头头是道，另一边又把中国崩溃论讲得好像很有道理。有这种左右互搏的功夫，堪称是学术型反华舆论的高手。他说，中国在经济规模上比苏联巅峰时期大得多，制造业增加值是美国的将近2倍，并特别强调了一个细节，如果跟中国发生热战，美国大概5天就会打完精确制导炸弹。你看，他用的都是具体数字， GDP 比例、制造业增加值，甚至精确到5天。这听起来非常客观，非常学术，但背后的潜台词是什么？是中国太强了，强到不正常，强到已经威胁到了我们的根本安全。他刻意不提的是，中国的制造业规模是过去几十年全球化产业分工的自然结果。中国也是联合国会费和维和经费的第2大出资国，始终承诺和平发展。他把一个发展的事实直接包装成了一个威胁的罪名，而他话锋一转，又开始推销中国崩溃论。他引用了一位叫彼得·图尔金的学者的社会崩溃模型，说这个模型原本是用来预测美国问题的，但福克森觉得这个模型好像更适合中国。他说，中国在人口结构和受过教育的人口过剩方面问题比美国更严重。这就是福克森这类学者的所谓高明之处。你质疑西方为什么不如中国发展的快时，他就说因为中国是个不守规则的威胁。当你看到中国持续发展时，他又说别看现在强，它内部问题一大堆，马上就要崩溃了。总之，结论永远是中国不对，中国不行，西方要警惕中国。我们再来看看他的另一个手法，选择性历史类比。为了证明西方眼前的困难都能过去，他大谈50年前的1973年，当时美国也是问题一堆，水门事件、通货膨胀、越战失败，但结果呢？7、8年后，里根上台，苏联解体，美国又赢了。他想说明西方有强大的自我修复能力，但一谈到中国，他的历史观就立刻变了。他不再提非线性发展和自我修复了，而是直接把17世纪明朝的灭亡拿出来类比，暗示中国也会走上古老文明崩溃的老路。他用西方的触底反弹来证明西方的韧性，却用中国的王朝更替来预言中国的命运。这根本不是客观的历史分析，这完全是双标的算命。那么为什么福克森们要这么费尽心机，非常学术范的编织这套矛盾的理论呢？第一是心理安慰。面对中国不可否认的崛起，一些西方精英内心充满了焦虑，中国崩溃论成了他们的精神安慰剂，仿佛只要等着中国自己出问题，西方的领导地位就能自然保住。第二是现实需要，中国威胁论是为政策服务的。你看他反复强调中国制造业是美国的2倍，战时美国弹药不够用，这些言论是说给谁听的？显然是说给美国的军工复合体和决策者听的。潜台词是快打钱，快扩军，不然就来不及了。第三是话语霸权，他们通过这种看似学术实则预设结论的分析，牢牢控制着国际舆论的解释权。中国无论做什么都逃不出他们设定的威胁或崩溃的框架。但事实胜于雄辩，说中国崩溃说了30年，中国却成为了世界第2大经济体。说人口危机，但中国正在推动高质量发展，努力从人口红利转向人才红利。说精英过剩，但正是这些受过高等教育的庞大群体成为了中国科技创新的主力军。 油管上这类视频很多，但看清了他们的这套话术，会让我们更清醒。世界在变化，旧的叙事已经无法解释新的现实，我们需要的是基于事实的平等的对话，而不是这种披着学术外衣的恐中症和盼中崩的循环播放。这种论调说多了，最终透支的是他们自己言论的可信度。